On April 20th, 1999, two high school seniors, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, walked into their school in Colorado and embarked on one of the worst mass shootings in history. They intended to detonate bombs, causing mass casualties in the cafeteria, but when this failed, they went on a shooting rampage, which resulted in the deaths of 14 classmates and teachers. What became known as the Columbine Massacre left a profound impact on the consciousness of the United States and became one of the formative events of the 21st century. The massacre was the bellwether of a new phenomenon of mass shootings, with disaffected youth, usually young men, acquiring weapons and going into schools or public areas with the intent to harm others before killing themselves. Since Columbine, the country has faced several other school shootings, including those at Virginia Tech, Newtown, Uvalde, and Parkland High School. We've also seen related crimes, for example, the Vice Market and Isla Vista shootings. In 2002, filmmaker Michael Moore made a documentary, Bowling for Columbine, which examined the question of these massacres. He looked into why two teenagers, Dylan and Eric, not only took their own lives, but chose to harm so many others, committing a nihilistic crime. In one scene, Moore emphasizes a theme of the film. Why are these shootings so common to the United States, but not elsewhere? Why is this an American phenomenon? It's clear that Western civilization has changed immensely over the last century. These changes include the rise of a material culture, a decline of community, a rise of life comparison apps, a decline of spiritual values, and the internet simultaneously connecting and isolating us. All phenomena leading to feelings of alienation, rejection, and disaffection. While these factors are consistent across all Western countries, we have to inquire into what's unique about the United States that causes it to have so many of these massacres. While there are examples of these attacks elsewhere, like the École Polytechnique attack in Quebec and Anders Breivik's attack in Norway, most mass shootings occur in America, and with such frequency that it's become a routine phenomenon. An argument is this derives from culture or values. One way America is unlike other Western powers, like Canada and France, is due to its deeply internalized sense of individualism. While this promotes self-reliance in industry, it also produces negative sociological effects. The French, for example, have a different kind of social consciousness, one based on the idea of social solidarity. This means they primarily identify with their class or culture, as opposed to identifying themselves as social isolates. Solidarity is a subtle but powerful force in society. It invokes an idea of collective responsibility, rather than delegating all needs to the individual. There's some irony in this comparison between America and France. In the early 1800s, the thinker Alexis de Tocqueville went on a tour of the United States. He turned this into a kind of sociological study, wanting to compare the Republican United States with, at that time, the autocratic France. One of his major observations was that Americans formed associations that promoted a sense of community and social connection. This was different from France, where people were atomized and separated. While this may have been the reality in America at that time, in the modern period, the country has gone through a major change. A decline of attendance at religious services, a loss of third spaces, a rising power of social media and phones, and a lack of community outside of schools have had a noticeable effect. European countries are also more densely populated, causing more social interactions. The United States, with its car culture and vaster distances, encourages people to live isolated in their homes and travel from place to place by car, often alone. The rise of life comparison apps may be one of this time's worst developments. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has shown that anxiety, depression, and negative views of oneself all amplify the more one uses these apps. Though it's unlikely society will police their use, it's a choice for individuals to use them or not. We usually compare ourselves to peers in assessing our life's progress. These apps both create an illusion of success, as users exaggerate the positive aspects of their lives and omit the negative, and show off the small minority of the top 1% who live the most privileged lives. It would follow that mental health issues would increase with each new generation that's increasingly online. Being raised on the internet brings issues for socialization and balanced personal development. If we look at other studies of differences in happiness and life satisfaction, another pattern emerges. Modern life encourages individualism, moral liberty, and the short-term pursuit of pleasure. What we observe is those who reject these values, who live in the same traditional ways that humans have for millennia, report the highest levels of happiness. We've explored this dilemma before. While for most of history, human beings lived hard lives of subsistence and self-denial, after achieving these needs, we struggle for a purpose. While religion and mythology satisfied us in prior time periods, in our modern era, we have little alternative but aspirations to wealth, power, and materialism. In another video, we looked at Tina Fey's movie Mean Girls and tried to unpack its meaning for our culture. We said that the social world of high school was a kind of Darwinist jungle, people competing for status and hierarchy in an unequal system. We said that the theme of the film, that we should value people as individuals and not based on their external characteristics, was a takeaway we were supposed to apply to daily life. Yet when we reviewed the social developments that have happened since the film, which came out in 2004, we agreed the culture hasn't become less shallow, but more materialistic and more comparative. Instagram and similar apps are the best example of this, creating a century of the self, where the human being is commodified, turned into a product for consumption. These images create ideas of success that are unachievable by most, and leave people with feelings of inadequacy. Related to this is the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who presented his pyramid of needs, exploring the different requirements for a human being to feel complete and be able to engage with society fully. We've explored this chart before, and how difficult it is to satisfy all of them. We explained that mental health and trauma often arise from deficiencies, especially early deficiencies on this pyramid. If we examine the case of Randy Stair, the so-called ghost girl killer, who became obsessed with an animated character from the show Danny Phantom, we can see a pattern of withdrawal and isolation, and the projection of his personal and romantic needs onto a fictional character. Stair doing this fits into a recurring pattern amongst the school shooters in developing abnormal forms of sexuality. Another example of this is Eliot Rodger, who became so obsessed with his feelings of sexual inadequacy that he took his frustrations out on society. Not only these two, but other figures like Sui Hung Cho, Eric Harris, and Adam Lanza fit a pattern of absent sexual experience. While this situation doesn't excuse their actions, it helps us understand the origins of their feelings of resentment and psychological imbalance. In an individualist culture, love and belongingness needs are delegated to individuals to fulfill, and in a masculinized culture, those who fail to achieve them are ostracized. From a Freudian perspective, guns are phallic simulacra. This means they represent a compensation for feelings of sexual inadequacy. We can even see this in figures like Randy Stair or Eric Harris, who gave their weapons female names. A remedy here is a less materially competitive culture, one where everyone has intrinsic self-worth, without connoting feelings of exclusion or inferiority to those who are sexually excluded. In a previous video, we explored the death of religion in the West, with church attendance having dropped precipitously since the 90s. If we remove a judgment about the rectitude of religion and simply review the situation as social scientists, we can observe the sociological effects. Even without an inner meaning, it's clear religion played an essential role, socially, communally, and morally. Religion has been a part of civilization for millennia, whether manifesting through priests, Brahmins, or village seers. Thus, the sudden removal of it in the last 30 years makes our time into an outlier. One of its most important roles is in providing community and third spaces, something which, in our digitized time, we're increasingly missing. Religion also promotes different values. It values virtues like humility, modesty, piety, and devotion, traits that aren't valued in our time. It promotes the idea that everyone has intrinsic worth as a spiritual being, and in the absence of these values, we become more materialistic, comparative, and competitive. Finally, while in previous eras one would go for counsel to a priest, today this has been replaced with a psychiatrist. While psychiatry tries to be clinical and scientific, religion has a different approach, investing one's experiences with meaning and purpose in a more holistic response to trauma. While religion is unlikely to return on a mass scale, we can learn from the social and moral values it provided, understanding how recreating them can have beneficial social effects. Dating back to the 1950s, bullying and hazing were major parts of American schools. However, as the decades have gone by, they become increasingly less acceptable. At the same time, bullying is socially complicated. In the movie Mean Girls, merely to exist in a high school means to exist in a social hierarchy. Even without overt bullying, social exclusion and rejection are experiences that have real emotional effects. Accounts of bullying of Dylan and Eric are conflicted. In the original wave of responses after the attack in 1999, bullying was cited as one of the major causes. As time went by, this interpretation was mentioned less and less, transitioning instead to violence in film and video games, and ultimately settling on the availability of guns. We can recognize that society has taken many steps towards stigmatizing bullying and adding more interventions from teachers, psychiatrists, and school administrators. We can also acknowledge that bullying is no excuse for homicide. One of the points Michael Moore makes in his documentary, Bowling for Columbine, is that Canada has more guns per capita than the United States, but lacks the level of gun violence of America. I thought this was right for years, but on researching this video, I found it wasn't correct. On charts of gun ownership, the United States has the most per capita in the world, and owns 4 times more than Canada. While we've discussed the cultural origins of gun violence in America, we need to acknowledge the role of access to weapons. The United States is a major outlier compared to other countries, including other gun cultures like Canada, Russia, and Finland. It follows that if you have angry or volatile people, and combine that with ubiquitous or easy access to guns, you increase the chances of a mass shooting. Given the population of the United States, and how easy it is for people to become disaffected, suicidal, or alienated, it's not surprising these crimes are as common as they are. At the same time, a counter to the gun argument is to review the number of firearms per person in individual states. This does show that some states, like Wyoming, have the highest numbers of guns but the lowest levels of violent crime, while others like Illinois have stricter gun access but much higher levels of violence. The culture of guns in the United States creates a difficult situation politically. The country was founded on the Second Amendment, or the right to bear arms, a Lockean proviso the founders wrote into the Constitution. At the time, the country was engaged in an insurrection against the British, and relied on its citizens to bear arms and participate in resistance to achieve independence. Machiavelli said that in a republic, the ruler should arm his subjects, as it creates a sense of solidarity and causes the population to identify their rights with those of the government. In theory, in the United States, if the government ever becomes tyrannical, it becomes the people's right to overthrow it. And with increasing levels of military sophistication, the argument the public should have access to comparable weapons is supported by gun advocates. Michael Moore settled on the role of guns in his documentary, Bowling for Columbine, as opposed to cultural issues. Following massacres, both Obama and Trump supported efforts at gun control in the United States, before backing down due to the efforts of gun advocates. Partisanship in America has made gun control on a federal level effectively impossible, with most efforts being deflected into the alternate area of mental health. While America's gun culture prevents the challenging of the Second Amendment, an alternative is to reduce the number of guns per capita or make access to them more difficult. Ultimately, if we view the United States as a federation rather than a unitary republic, we can look to individual states to address the gun crisis. If we look at the populations and sizes of states, they're often comparable to European countries. Thus, it can be up to individual states to decide if they want to police gun access or not. The American mental health system is cited as another source for the school shooting crisis, though the system has improved over the years. The numbers of school counselors and psychiatrists have increased and have taken on more active roles, helping to identify and assist troubled students before they become too disaffected. One of the challenges is providing social supports without stigmatizing students and making accurate threat assessments. Another challenge is the American healthcare system. The United States has a hybrid model, with public insurance provided via Medicare and Medicaid, and private insurance through the workplace. The country pays more for healthcare than any other first world nation, in addition to leaving many cracks and holes in coverage. Connected with this is the cost of psychiatric care, and that is often not provided by health plans. Balancing patient rights is another difficulty. Involuntary hospitalization is dehumanizing and legally difficult to achieve, and hospitalization is expensive and inhumane, creating incentives for discharging patients. Follow-up in community care is costly and hard to maintain, and outpatients have the liberty to resume their lives without further treatment. In addition, medications are expensive, require discipline to take each day, and often have side effects, encouraging non-compliance. As we mentioned, trauma is produced by unmet needs and social harms experienced in society. In an individualist culture like the United States, it's hard to ensure all people are able to enter adulthood as happy, whole, and well-adapted individuals. Connected to this is the destigmatization of mental health, viewing issues as injuries produced by trauma, the same as any physical injury. If we attempt to categorize the shooters, we can identify certain patterns. In 2017, Randy Stair carried out the Vice Market attack in Pennsylvania, killing 3 people and then himself. While he articulated a desire to carry out an attack at his former high school, with it closed down, he chose to do one at his workplace instead. Stair is one of the most psychologically interesting of the shooters. In early life, he was happy, well-adjusted, and socially capable, but became reclusive and withdrawn over time. The computer seems to have had a negative influence on him, letting him fulfill his social needs without leaving the house, and causing him to descend into isolation. His early life saw him develop an interest in YouTube as a vehicle for his creativity. His early channel involved comedy skits, and even developed a real following. He went to college for filmmaking but didn't follow through, and ended up working at a supermarket without a clear life direction. Over time, his videos shifted in tone. They became darker and more violent, reflecting the psychic changes he was going through. While in his video diaries he talks about having the same sexual developments as others, he also explains having no dating experience and failing to develop his feelings into healthy sexual relationships. In high school, he received some interest from a girl who he rejected, and later received interest from female friends who met him through his YouTube channel. He did appear to have close connections to them, even writing one in his suicide note before he committed the Vice Market attack. Stair is sometimes known as the Ghost Girl Killer, after developing a strange limerence for an animated character. While this type of fantasy is appropriate for young children, the fact it remained into adulthood shows the disturbed sexual psychology of Stair. In our video on McDonald's, we talked about the idea of brand imprinting, and many early childhood shows, like those on Nickelodeon, provoke feelings of comfort, security, and familiarity. These feelings of being safe and well-adjusted, preceding the turmoil of later adolescence, might explain the long-term association Stair felt for the character Ember McLean from the Danny Phantom TV show. We can speculate Stair developed a kind of avoidant psychology, and then came to find comfort in an imagined romance with a fictional character. He then developed a delusional and schizotypal fantasy world based around the supernatural, showing the influence of New Age beliefs in an effort to rationalize and compensate for his confused life. He convinced himself everything happened for a reason and interpreted everything as an omen or a sign. He developed his own belief system about the afterlife, believing everyone joined squads of ghosts after they died. Stair is an interesting case because he shows the confused, troubled psychologies of these perpetrators. While their issues are no excuse to hurt other people, by studying them we can gain greater insight and capacity for treatment for them in the future. In 2014, Eliot Rodger carried out the Isla Vista shooting in California, killing 6 people and then himself. Born to wealthy parents on the West Coast, Rodger led a privileged life. However, he struggled to build healthy romantic relationships, which resulted in an obsessive and self-hating temperament he struggled to break out of. Despite having a wealthy father, enjoying material abundance, and even receiving his own BMW, he struggled to extrovert himself and develop normal friendships. If we review his manifesto, like many of the other killers, he appears to have spent too much time on the computer in isolation, fulfilling most of his social needs over the internet as opposed to in real life. It's likely Rodger had a personality with an extremely high level of introversion, something maladapted to extroverted American society. He appears to have had many wrong expectations about relationships, expecting others to reach out and come to him, rather than him seeking the contact he wanted to experience. The problem arose in Rodger's response to these challenges. Rather than look at himself and reflect on how he could improve, he developed an extraordinary and obsessive level of anger and resentment at others, the world, and society. Rodger developed anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, and developed an intense amount of self-hatred, feeling emasculated, ostracized, and excluded. His privileged upbringing, wealth, and appearance may have been the origins of his narcissism. However, his obsession with his sexual inexperience and feelings of inadequacy were likely the main source of it. We can characterize him as a fragile narcissist, meaning his grandiosity was a kind of compensation for his internalized feelings of worthlessness. While a recurring theme across all the shooters is a confused form of sexuality, Rodger is the clearest in articulating this as the main motivation for his crime. We can psychoanalyze Rodger and understand the origins of his behavior, responding to his circumstances by blaming others, amplifying his resentment, and turning to violence over time. As we said, Eric Harris was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre in Colorado. While Harris began his youth as a normal adolescent, as he progressed through high school, he developed a volatile psychology. He became motivated by grievance and resentment, which expressed itself in juvenile delinquency, that when he was put before a judge for petty crime, he was lenient with him, wanting to give him a second chance so he could have a future. Harris embraced hatred and ill will as virtues, and as we can see in his journals, came to despise his classmates, other people, and the world. When socially called out for his behavior, he responded with excessive anger, showing a deep level of resentment and a lack of accountability. In Michael Moore's documentary, both Marilyn Manson and Matt Stone discuss the alienation of Harris. They mention how, 20 years later, high school would have been in the deep past. He would have a totally new life, with an utterly different view of the world. Manson explains how music is an outlet for young people, and how growing up is difficult, alienating, and hurtful. He explains how music can relieve feelings of exclusion and provide relief from suffering and loss. In our video on Mean Girls, we discussed how in high school as a fragile youth, you're inserted in a competitive hierarchy you barely have an understanding of. High school makes the dramas, conflicts, and embarrassments of daily life assume a great significance, while in the real spin of one's life, they're not. One of the baffling parts of Columbine is that as seniors, Dylan and Eric were graduating from school in months, and after that would never see most of their classmates again, moving on to start new lives in the workforce, military, or college. When we read the journals of Dylan Klebold, he comes off as a conflicted teenager, perhaps more a follower of Eric. He writes about his insecurities and the girls he's infatuated with, seeming to long more for connection, in contrast to Harris's obsessive anger. Perhaps without his friend's influence, he wouldn't have gotten involved in their destructive crime. One of the ironies of Harris's attack, something repeated later by Randy Stair, was his wearing a shirt that said natural selection, While he likely had a fantasy of superiority and homicidal power, there's a lack of awareness of his fate after committing a murder-suicide. Finally, Dylan and Eric recorded themselves on the so-called basement tapes, bragging about the crime they're about to commit and how they'll be remembered. There's something grim about these being made at the end of the 1990s, which many remember as a halcyon decade, before the 9/11 attacks, global financial crisis, and rise of wealth inequality. The shooters clearly thought their tapes would be released publicly and would inspire future imitators, but they never were. Law enforcement never released them, other than textual summaries, knowing the tapes were supposed to encourage others to reenact their crime. In 2012, Adam Lanza carried out the Sandy Hook shooting in Connecticut, killing 27 people. The Sandy Hook massacre is in its own category. When it happened, the horror of it made a deep impact on the United States. Uniquely, in the attack, Lanza targeted elementary school children after shooting his mother, then took his own life. This attack was one of the most upsetting, as people intuit something uniquely disturbed about the killer's motivation. Lanza was very intelligent, which we can see in a recording of one radio interview he made. However, he was socially and emotionally maladjusted and engaged in repeated rituals of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Like Rodger, he was excessively introverted and aloof, and spent most of his time indoors in a dark room, isolating himself. In another video, we discussed the paradox of the internet, which rose to prominence for the first time in the 1990s, that while it provides an extraordinary social opportunity, the ability to connect with people all over the world, it also represents a danger in letting us fulfill all our social needs over the computer, causing us to neglect real life, and resulting in an imbalanced development. As a product of homeschooling and a lack of normal socialization, the one location where Lanza may have felt some form of social normality was probably in elementary school. We often gravitate toward locations of comfort or safety. There's a strange cognitive dissonance where school shooters desecrate the same places where they felt security and stability before. If we use Freudian analysis of Lanza's attack and view the gun as a sexual simulacrum, then it suggests an abnormal sexual development in him. In other words, a kind of pedophilic motivation behind his crime. This, manifested as his targeting of elementary school children, makes his massacre one of the most disturbed. In 2018, Nikolas Cruz carried out the Parkland High School shooting in Florida, resulting in the deaths of 17 people. Unlike the others, he surrendered rather than commit suicide. Cruz is much less sophisticated than the other shooters, while Stair, Rodger, and Harris were each tormented in their own way, and made efforts to articulate their twisted worlds in journals, video diaries, and manifestos. Cruz demonstrates none of this. There's a video he made which summarizes his criminal motivation as "just do it." He glibly explains people will see the results of his actions on the news later. He acts like he's leaving to play a video game to get the highest score. He shows a frivolous attitude toward the idea of massacring innocent people, with no understanding of the suffering, pain, or hardship that would come from this. He presents as more concerned with short-term celebrity than the harm that'll cause. When interviewed by the detective after his crime, he feigned mental illness and hallucinations. He tried to pretend he was much more psychologically complicated than he was, recalling the son of Sam, who heard voices and cited demonic influences. The detective responded to Cruz's fantasy so appropriately and artfully that I recommend watching the interview for yourself. Rather than validate Cruz, he condescends to him, probing him with questions if the demons are in the room with them. Cruz is one of the most foolish of the killers, representing the true meaninglessness of an attack of this kind, and the absurdity that one can be a victim of someone so ignorant. On his album Hollywood, Marilyn Manson made a song reflecting on the Columbine massacre. In it, he reflects on the psychology of alienated youth. Narrating from the perspective of the killers, he repeats a grim line, referring to themselves and their lives as dirt. He assesses the news agencies cynically, affirming just as he did in Michael Moore's documentary, that they're only concerned with exploiting these tragedies for ratings. Repeated is the idea that through their crime, the perpetrators will be remembered and gain some kind of celebrity, legacy, or prestige that they commit their crime for a memory in history. The indie band Foster the People achieved celebrity for the song Pumped Up Kicks. Its cheery and upbeat music contrasts with the lyrics of the song. The title refers to the Reebok shoes of the 90s, which affluent kids would wear in school. These symbolize the inferiority felt by the speaker, who uses his crime to compensate and show his social power. One lyric says Robert's got a quick hand, referring to the perpetrator of the West Roads Mall shooting, with a drawl like a Western cowboy and a cigarette dangling out of the perpetrator's mouth. The imagery isn't negative, but empowering. Another lyric, a sad one, describes a caring father coming home to support his son, contrasting this with the youth's feelings of alienation and social rejection. The killer then takes his father's weapon, recalling figures like Stair or Lanza, who did their crimes with family guns. A recurring lyric is a call for the perpetrator's victims to run, emphasizing their vulnerability. With this view, the song seems to be a kind of celebration of violence, an anthem suggesting that violence represents a kind of liberation from the material, a kind of revolt to revolution against the human condition and its injustices and inequalities. Despite this, the band has deflected this interpretation, arguing the song is a reflection on homicide, portraying the fantasy of a killer alone, and in fact condemning those who commit such massacres, with one band member even having a relative who survived the Columbine massacre. I often analyze paintings in my works, like Salvador Dali's Christ of John the Baptist in a previous video. I also like to reflect on images that I feel embody an era, like the image I used in the Woodstock 99 video. Though I can't show the uncensored video on YouTube, the essential image that came out of the Columbine massacre is this one, showing the bodies of Dylan and Eric at the end of their massacre. As a painting, we could title it There Is Nothing, and dating it back to 1999, the same year as the photo from Woodstock, it represents the end of the Christian era and the beginning of the 21st century. In the 1800s, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche talked about what he called the death of God. While we can interpret this as an atheistic statement, we can also view it as the death of what God represents, the idea of higher, inclusive, and transcendental values. This image shows two children dead by suicide after having committed a massacre against a school that tried to foster and protect them. The core meaning is nihilism, the idea that there is nothing, no higher principle or purpose other than material existence. The image says to revolt and die, to refuse to participate in life's game, to reject hierarchy and competition, and instead embrace destruction and suicide. As it's an image of two 18-year-olds, there's the idea to throw one's life away. There's an arrogance to the image, the killer saying they're smarter than us, smarter than everyone. There's the idea of you hurt me, I'll hurt you. In an image, the killers profess certain knowledge about the universe, claiming there's no afterlife, no spirit, and no reincarnation. There's the idea of rebellion, and the affirmation again and again, there is nothing. If we review the Columbine massacre, Dylan and Eric tried to create a kind of murder-suicide cult, which continues to resonate with and be reenacted by troubled youth in the United States. In other videos, we discussed figures like the Buddha, who, when repulsed by the competitiveness and selfishness of the human condition, made the decision to renounce the world and embrace a radical, simple life. We explored the life of one American, Chris McCandless, who embraced a kind of secular version of this lifestyle, traveling the country and venturing to Alaska. Dylan and Eric represent the beginning of a bleak, material version of this impulse, which reflects the values of the United States. Rather than maintain the hope there's a higher power, that there's some spiritual purpose or end for suffering, at 18 they presumed a complete knowledge of the cosmos. The tale of Dylan and Eric is one of two children killing children, of them disappointing and betraying their parents, friends, and teachers, and leaving behind a legacy of harm and pain. Their final image, There Is Nothing, inaugurates the 21st century and is an expression of the forces of sex, death, and nihilism.